All right, well, welcome back. This is still adding style with CSS. That's still Helen, and I'm still Christopher. And yay! And we left off the last module, really kind of focused in on finding element and how conflicts work. And when we took a look at applying those particular items, we really kind of saw at a very basic level. So we did like classes and IDs and so forth. But, you know, as we all know, our pages are going to be much more complex than that. So I may need to change something based on where it is on the page, or based on the hierarchy, or maybe even based on what the user is currently doing. So if they put their mouse over something, it might be nice to go ahead and highlight that particular spot. And you'll notice that CSS is going to give us a lot of great power in going in and finding the particular sections and items and elements and otherwise that we want on the page. Now, as a real quick side note, a lot of people have asked in the Q&A about CSS3. And one of the things that we didn't mention earlier that's definitely worth mentioning now is, well, CSS, like everything else, is changing over time. And different browsers are implementing different components and pieces sort of on their own schedule, and sometimes they're going to go off and do kind of their own thing. Now, fortunately, as we're going to see a little bit later on today, sometimes they'll actually throw in their own vendor-specific prefix in front of different proposed CSS options, tags, properties, or otherwise. But the long and short of it is, unfortunately, you are going to find that certain things are not always going to work in all browsers. So you will have to go in and test. You will have to kind of make sure that everything still looks good, even if it doesn't necessarily look perfect from browser to browser to browser. And this is probably going to be the first, or not probably, this will be the first section that we're going to see sometimes behavior like that. So it might work in IE, might not work in Chrome, might not work in Safari.
Yeah. So I mean, CSS3, it is CSS. It's a list. It's basically a list of standards that the W3C organization has proposed. They're saying, you know, CSS should contain these things. It should do these things, but it's up to different browsers to actually implement them, right?
Yep.
So when we say CSS3, we typically mean, oh, these are the standards that we expect CSS to behave in. This is what like modern day CSS should look like. Yep. So it is CSS, but there are new features that may or may not be implemented.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah, that's sort of the perfect way, I think, to put it. That's perfect. All right. In any event, let's go ahead and start digging in and taking a look at our different selectors here. So we're going to start off talking about the different ways that we can find items based on their structure. We'll then roll on into these things called pseudo classes and pseudo elements, which allow us to find items based on their type, or rather based on what's happening, what they're doing. And then we'll close it all off with a little section on sizing, and in particular focused in on font sizing rather than maybe sizing boxes and things like that, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But first, let's start talking about our document structure. And I'm actually going to sort of sidestep for a little bit. I'm going to go slightly off center here. And what I want to do is I want to take a look at my little sample page here that I've created, and it's very ugly right now, and that's sort of by design, because what I want to do is gussy this up a little bit over the next handful of demos and kind of make this look the way that we want it to look. And by the way, if you're curious, there's a great little website, Bacon Ipsum, that's a lorem ipsum generator that uses, you know, all sorts of different meat products. You've got all of that there. There's all sorts of other ones out there. There's like a hipster Ipsum. There's a vegetarian Ipsum. So there's all sorts of different Ipsum generators that are out there. This is just the one that I went with. But in any event, very, very, you know, ugly. You'll notice that there is no formatting here, really, with the exception of my my little list up at the top here. And I would also mention, just kind of go in and highlight the HTML here, that what I did was I used HTML5. And for those of you not familiar with HTML5, HTML5, among other things, introduces a lot of semantic tags, where rather than saying this is how I want it to display, because that's the job of CSS, what we're going to do is describe the data that's contained inside of it. So that's our nav section, that's our navigation section. And there's an article, and then inside of my article, I've got two different sections inside of my article. And I really like the collapsible regions here. Kind of makes it a little bit easier to see. So we've got our nav section up top, we've got our article, we've got our article. Okay, now I am going to, and again, I'm doing this for simplicity's sake. And I don't want you to look at this and think, oh, well, he's sort of doing a do as I say, not as I do type thing, because I'm not doing that. I'm just trying to make my demos go a little bit easier. So you are going to notice that I'm not going to create a separate style file here. Should I? 100%. And if I was doing this in production, I would 100% have a separate file for this. But because of the fact that I want the ability to show the HTML and the style very easily, I want the ability to bounce back and forth between the style section and that HTML and be able to make those quick little changes. It's going to be easier for demos if I just put the style here. So don't hate me because I'm putting the style inside the HTML page. I know this is not best practice. This is just going to make the demos easier. Okay. By the way, one little side note. People have asked about this little sidebar over here. This is one of the cool little features inside scroll. There we go. Yeah, so you'll notice under scroll bars here, just type up top scroll bars. So let me just click on that. That over there, you have the ability to set up the bar mode, which is the classic, or you've got map mode, and that gives you that little bar right there. So that way I can go in and mouse over and actually see what's inside of there. And that's a cool little feature inside of 2013. Okay. In any event, let's go back to my little page, and what you're going to notice is right up at the very top, I've got my navigation section. So of course I've got a bunch of anchor tags inside of there, and I want to style those. So maybe I want to make them bold, and maybe I want to take away the underline that's on them. So maybe those are the two things that I want to be able to do to that. Well, that's perfect for navigation, because if I'm looking at a page and I see the navigation section, what am I expecting inside of a navigation section? I'm expecting links. Makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I don't need that visual clue of an underline. But if I'm looking at an article, I'm going to need something that's going to be some form of a visual clue, and maybe that's an underline, maybe that's a different font color, or something like that. So long and short is the links that I'm going to have in an article, I probably want to look a little bit different than the ones that I have over here. All right, well, how can I tackle that? Well, one way that I could potentially tackle that, since we know we're not going to be able to just simply say A and apply that to all anchor tags, because that's going to apply globally, so we can't do that. One way that I could do this is I could create one class here for my nav section, and then another class over here. But you know, that's going to become a little bit of a pain, because I'm going to have to remember to always put that class in again and again and again and again. And when you start talking about things like Bootstrap, I'm going to bring up Bootstrap again, which is very class driven, you're going to find that you've got a little bit of HTML and a ton of class mentions. So if we can do something without having to always add in a class, that's going to make our lives easier. So that way we don't have to remember to always put it into there. We've got a lot less clutter on our page, and we're able to say, based on the document structure, this is how we want something to look. On top of that, if I later move something from one spot to another somewhere on my page, because of the fact that we're using those pseudo elements, those pseudo classes, or the document structure selectors, it's automatically going to pick up that style based on where I put it. So really a better way to do things. So let's start off by taking a look at how we can identify things based on document structure. So let's take a look at a little bit of CSS here. And let's talk about our parent-child and our containers. Now, inside of CSS, on the selector, if I say class and class, so nav A, for example, what I'm saying is I'm looking for an anchor tag anywhere inside of that nav element. So I've got a nav element, inside of there's an anchor, and it's only going to apply to an anchor that's inside of a nav bar. If, however, I add in that little angle bracket, and it's subtle, but it makes a huge difference, then the anchor tag must be a direct child of, in this case, nav. I think the best way to do it is to see it.
Yeah.
Let's get in and actually dig into it. Okay. So let me open up my little nav section here, and here's my little style, and I'm going to start off by doing this the incorrect way. And I sort of like starting with the incorrect way, and that way we can see, wait a minute, nothing happened, and then we go back and make it work. So remember that with that little angle bracket, what that's going to mean is it has to be a direct child. And if we take a look at our structure here, what we're going to notice, there's all of our anchor tags. Those are obviously not direct children of nav, because they're all inside of LI, all inside of UL. List item, unordered list. And then nav. So this is not going to work. So if I go in and I say text decoration, none, and I say font, weight, and let's say bold, what you're going to notice is if I, I do have my browser, there it is. Perfect. Let's go ahead and hit refresh, and you're going to notice no change because that angle. So if I take that away, and now I save and I come back over here and I hit refresh, now you're going to notice everything is bold, and you're also going to notice that all of my underlines are gone. By the way, I'm going to do this real quick as well. I'm just going to globally apply this font family, and let's use a Verdana. I think that's just going to make things a little bit easier. There we go. I think that looks a little bit better.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of serif fonts on screen, just ever.
Okay, perfect. All right. So this makes you much happier then.
Yes.
Okay.
But I wasn't going to say anything otherwise.
All right. I appreciate that.
I'm polite.
And I appreciate that. Okay. So what you're going to notice here is that now my underlines are gone, and now it's bold, again because of that space rather than the angle bracket. So let me just kind of put in the comment here. Space is going to be contained inside of element. And let me just also put in a comment right here is that the angle bracket indicates a direct parent-child relationship. There we go. And again, we will be sharing all of this out on GitHub. I'll go in and check all of those, and we'll put the links into the chat window, because I know everybody's probably wondering where they can go get all of this. All right, cool. So there's very kind of simple, based on where it happens to be, we want to go in and highlight things. And that's good, and that's perfect for things like this. But you know, let's come back over to our little section over here, and maybe what we want to be able to do on the text is maybe we want to be able to highlight kind of the first letter, or maybe we want to be able to highlight the first paragraph and then use a different font down below and things like that. And fortunately, we can go in and clean all of that up. I am going to do one real quick thing, only just because it's bothering me. Heather's going to talk about this a little bit later, but I am just going to do padding bottom, and let me just do 20 pixels. There we go. It was really bugging me. I needed a little bit of space there.
No, I get it.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay. Back to our slides. Cool. So like I said, what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to identify, for example, the first letter, or the first paragraph, or the first block, or maybe based on something being highlighted. That is where pseudo classes and pseudo elements come into play. Now, the difference between a pseudo class and a pseudo element is very subtle, syntax, and both just sort of semantically, technically. that a pseudo class is going to apply to an entire element. And that's based on where that element is or based on the current state. So if somebody has put their mouse over it, if somebody's highlighted it, actually highlighted isn't right, but if somebody's put their mouse over it, if it's at the top, if it's at the bottom, if it's the last item, if it's an odd item, if it's an even item, etc., all of that is where pseudo classes come into play. So rather than me explicitly having to say dot and then the name of a class, and then inside of HTML saying class equals, it's going to be based on something about that element. So for example, it might be the first item in the hierarchy. So maybe we want to bump up the font size just a little bit on the first paragraph and then a slightly smaller font on everything else. Or maybe for the last item, that we know the last item that's going to be down at the very bottom, it's going to be inside of a div tag, but we know that that's where our copyright is going to be, so maybe we want to make that smaller. Then we can go in and do that. Or maybe we want to apply a style if it happens to be the only child. So maybe this is a search results page, and what we want to display is, sorry, no results found, and we want that to appear with a particular type of font. We can do all of that with pseudo classes. So pseudo classes are all based on something about that element, based on where it is or based on what's going on. So it could be based on position. So first child, last child, the nth child inside of its particular parent. By the way, the nth child, you will notice, will actually take a number, or you can also use the text odd and even. Now, for anybody who's been programming HTML for a little while, you're probably all familiar with having to go in and try to set something up for that, you know, that different shading for odd or for even. There, problem solved. Odd, even, done. So much easier. Okay, and then you'll also notice that we've got position and type. And this one really, I think, is subtle. I don't want to use the word confusing, but it definitely is subtle. And here's the way that this is going to work. Let me, there we go, do this. Let's say I said div colon first of type, and then I set, you know, whatever my style happened to be, and then let's up here say that I said div and I said first child like this. There we go. All right, so what's the difference between me saying first child and me saying first of type? It's a great question. And the answer is that first of type is going to be based on where that div tag is on the entire page. So it's the absolute first div tag. Contrast that with first child. First child is going to be based on its parent container. And let's do this. Let's go back into Visual Studio here. I think this is going to be sort of an easier way to drill into this. So let's open up my couple little sections here, and we'll leave it like this. Okay, so what I want you to notice is there is my little section in a div tag, and there is my little section in a div tag. Now in both of these cases here, these both are first child. The reason that they're both first child is because they're both the first child of that section element. So they're the first div tag inside of that section. So if I wanted to do something with the first paragraph in each section, I can now do that. But this one right here also happens to be the first of type. Why? Because it's the first div tag that appears anywhere on my page. So first child, based on the parent, first of type, first time that that thing appears anywhere. Now, for me, in my personal experience, I generally don't find myself using first of type all that often, but I do find myself using last of type periodically. And again, it's for that little section down at the very bottom. So that way, if you've got, all of your little links about, now hiring and about us and the copyright and all of that, and that's contained inside of a div, and you know that that's always going to be at the end, that's perfect. That way you can just simply say last of type, and I know that that's always going to be the case. In fact, here, let's just go in and we'll add that right in. Let me just add in a div right down here, and now hiring. And whatever it is that we want to do. Okay, so let's go in and style all of that. So here's what I want to do, is I want to bump up the font size just a little bit of the initial paragraphs, and I want to make that bottom section, let's just say red, just to kind of make it very, very obvious there. Okay, and let me also, I'm just going to say font size, and I'm going to say 16 pixels. And let me see, how's that going to look here? Okay, that's perfect actually. Excellent. All right. So now, let me go in and I want to grab first paragraph of each section. And if you remember, our paragraphs are currently set up as div tags. Okay. So I'm going to say div, colon, and then you'll notice I've got first child. And then I can just say curly brace, and now I can say font size, and let's go ahead and make that 20 pixels, which is probably bigger than we would really want it, but I'm trying to make it really obvious here. So first child, and now let's come back over here, let's hit refresh, and now you'll notice that's nice and big, and let's scroll down, there's our second paragraph, our third paragraph, our fourth paragraph, and our fifth paragraph in that section. And then you'll notice once again, big. Now let me update the text. I think that's also going to make it a little bit more obvious here. So let's just go in and say first in section, scroll on down, and first in section. And now let's come back over here, hit refresh, and then you'll notice that that one is nice and big. Scroll on down, small, 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 and then again, nice and big. You're looking at me like you have a question.
Could you scroll up in the code? Why is it that, so what is the first child of div?
Okay, so that's a great question, because that's sort of the way that it reads, that it looks like it's saying, I'm looking for the first child of the div tag, but it's not. So what a pseudo class or pseudo element applies to is to the tag in question. So I'm not looking for a child of div. I'm looking for div, and I'm trying to see what it's a child of. So that's a great question, because when you look at it, and I did that too when I first looked at this, when I was first learning this, is that I looked at that and I said, wait a minute, is this looking for the first child inside of div? It's not. It's looking at the div tag and looking at the structure of the div tag. So it's not looking at the contents of the div tag. It's looking at the div tag itself and seeing, is it the first child of something? So great question. Great question. Okay. Now, let's also go in and say div, and I'm going to say last of type. And then let's just go in and say color colon blue, and let's say font size, and let's make that 12 pixels. Okay. And now let's again come back, hit refresh, and now what you're going to notice, you weren't supposed to do that. Ha! You're not supposed to do it that way. All right, in any event, it's actually putting it on the section, which it's not supposed to do. It's supposed to be on the page itself. So this is just sort of making a liar out of me. See, we're really cooking on the show. Live demos. Live demos right here in front of you.
We told you guys CSS is finicky, and this is one of the cases.
Exactly. All right. So in any event, so last of type is supposed to be the last of that item. I'm just going to make that go away for right now. That's really weird. I'll have to go back and work with that later. We're really cooking here. All right. In any event, so what I want you to notice, just to kind of review this, is that this allows me to, again, based on the document structure, do something different with it, which is cool. Now, I did one little thing inside of my Visual Studio here, and that is I hit Control-K, Control-D. Two-part shortcut, Control-K, Control-D, which formats the document. One of the things that you're going to notice about CSS is that this is going to get very big very quickly. And so formatting becomes a very important component. And so you'll notice there's my div, and then there is a pseudo class for div. And so you'll notice that that is tabbed in, and that is a best practice. So whatever you want globally, and then all of the pseudos you're going to want tabbed in. Okay, cool, cool, cool. Back to slides. There we go. Now, how about, rather than based on document structure, how about element state, based on what's going on? So maybe we want something to look different if you've clicked on it. Then maybe we want to bold it, like a checkbox. Or maybe if you hover over something, then we want to put the underline back onto it. Because if I go back to my page here, and let's just go all the way back up to the very top, we're going to notice there's our nav section. Okay, that's all, peachy keen, hunky-dory. But, it still would be really, really nice if we could make that more obvious, that that's a link. So when you put your mouse over it, it'd be nice to see an underline, don't you think?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, sure enough, we can do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say nav a colon and then hover. Hover, of course, just like the JavaScript. You hover over something. That's going to be when the mouse is over it. And then let's go ahead and say text decoration, and let's say underline. Cool. Save. Let's come back over here. Let's hit refresh. And now you're going to notice when I put my mouse over it that sure enough, we get those little underlines. So now I can clearly say, oh, look, okay, that is, in fact, a link. Cool. Now, let's come back over here real quick. And I want to highlight one other thing. So again, you're going to notice that the syntax colon in my pseudo class there. But you are going to notice that I can still go in and use everything else that I've used. So if you remember, that space, of course, means contained inside of an element. So this is now going to say that this is only going to apply to an anchor tag when somebody mouses over it, and that anchor tag is inside of a nav section. So you can get as explicit as you want when going in and defining those elements and how you want everything to look inside of a page. Cool. All right. Now, how about maybe finding the first letter or the first line of something? Or how about going in and doing something different based on selection? Because, I don't know about you, but I've never been a huge fan of the blue background, white text. Would it be nice to kind of do a yellow highlight? I mean, really, when you think about highlighting, what do you think of?
A highlighter.
Absolutely.
It's funny because this is something Chris really, really cares about. He made me change the highlighting in my Visual Studio yesterday to yellow.
That is a true story. I did in fact do that. Yes. See, it has to be yellow. All right. Everybody has their thing.
Yeah.
Okay. But in any event, so I want to make that yellow. Now, let's compare and contrast here. So when I hover over those little links, I'm hovering over the entire link, so that entire element. And if you remember, classes apply to element, so that's a pseudo class. If I highlight a section like I've done here, I've highlighted a portion of an element. So not the entire element, just a portion of the element. If we're going to be talking about first line, which is just going to be that right there, that's just that first line. So again, it's a portion of an element. So a pseudo element is where we're actually going to be creating an element on the fly. Now look, I know some of you are probably thinking, wow, that really seems to be, kind of splitting hairs. That's really kind of a semantic argument. And I'm with you. I generally don't focus too much on pseudo-class versus pseudo-element. The syntax is slightly different. You are going to notice that it's going to be a single colon versus a double colon. But here's the thing. With Visual Studio, if you hit a colon, it's automatically going to show you all of the pseudo-classes, 1 colon, and all of the pseudo-elements, 2 colons, right there. So if you don't want to have to worry about trying to remember whether or not something was, 2 colons or 1 colon, you don't have to worry about it. Just let Visual Studio kind of do its thing. And if you don't want to have to remember the little debate about pseudo elements versus pseudo classes, that's fine. You don't have to. That's the good news. Okay. Let's do a demo here. So let me go back in and let's go grab our little div tags and let's go in and say div, and I am going to do our selection. And you'll notice that I typed in colon and selection. So I didn't even type in the second colon, but again, the IntelliSense still works. So let's go ahead and take advantage of that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say color colon black, and I'm going to say background color colon yellow. There we go. And then let's also go in and say div colon, and I'm going to say my first letter, and let's go in and let's say font size, and let's make this nice and big. So let's say 36 pixels. And let's go in and say div first line. There we go. And let's go in and say font size, and let's make that 24. Let's also kind of make it a little bit more obvious as well. Let's go in and say font color. Oh, it's not font color. I knew I was going to do that eventually as well. And let's just make that green. Okay. 24 pixels. Cool. So now, if I come back over here to Visual Studio and I hit refresh, here's what I want you to notice. Is you're going to notice, sure enough, that first line is green. And you're going to notice that that first character is nice and big. And you're also going to notice, there we go, yellow background. See, that makes me happy when I go in and I select it. But my browser and all of that is set currently to full screen. So my first line is going from here to here. Okay, fine. But how about if I were to go in and I were to resize this? You'll notice that when I resize this, that it's still just that first line. There's no JavaScript here. None whatsoever. This is all based on CSS. And in fact, when we get into a later module, one of the things that I'm going to talk about is really try to avoid JavaScript. If you can get CSS to do it, let CSS do it. That's going to make your life that much easier. Okay. In any event, let me also do this real quick. Yeah.
So when Christopher was highlighting, you might have noticed that the first letter was still blue when he selected it, but everything else was yellow.
Keep talking.
And that's because, as we said before, it's what you select. What was the phrase that you used? The last...
Oh, last right.
Last right, exactly.
Yeah.
And so you'll see in the code that the selection is being used before, or I guess this is much better to say. The first child is set after the selection is set,
right.
So that, in essence, overwrites that.
Exactly. Exactly. And you could go in and start moving things around and tweak things. And that's where, going in and testing all of that really becomes very important. Okay. Now, sort of in the background, one of the things that I want you to notice is I made a real quick change here. And again, this sort of goes back to one of the things that we talked about earlier, is that you'll notice that I was able to do nav a :hover. So that's only going to apply to a tags inside of nav. And if we came back to our article and we kind of think about what it is that I was trying to accomplish here. Is I want the first paragraph to be big, because that's probably where the important stuff is, and I want the first line to be big, and I want the first letter, just for stylizing things, I want that to be big. So I want all of that to really be highlighted. But I only want that really for just the first paragraph inside of each section. So for the second paragraph, I just want it to be normal. Just, back to the way that it was. And if you remember, the way that I had it the first time, which was like this, little musical interlude for you. There we go. Let's go back in, hit refresh. And you'll notice, here's a second paragraph right here, and you'll notice that that first line is big and it's green and my first letter is nice and big. That's not what I wanted. That's not what I wanted. I just wanted that for that first paragraph. And sure enough, we can combine all of these as much as we want. So we can get as explicit on identifying the elements as we need to. So it makes it gives us a lot of power in going in and finding what we want.
Yeah. So again, because I see these in the questions.
Yeah.
Why is it that we use one set of colons for first child and two sets of colons for first letter? It's because, well, actually, Christopher,
sure.
You can answer this.
Here, let me just go in and do this. Is that one set of colon? This is for our pseudo class, and then the second set of colon is a pseudo element. So two sets of colon is a pseudo element. The one set of colon is a pseudo class. And about the best analogy that I can give, and forgive me, this is the best one that I can come up with. I took 4 years of French in high school. Bonjour, comment allez-vous? Je m'appelle Christopher. Ma grand-mère est flambée et le singe est disparu, which is a horrible, horrible American accent way of saying, hello, my name is Christopher. My grandmother's on fire and the monkey has disappeared. At least I think that's what I said. In any event, one of the hardest things that I struggled with when I was trying to learn French was trying to remember the genders of everything. So la versus la. And in a lot of ways, I think that's sort of the same thing here, is that pseudo-class versus pseudo-element. Is there a difference? Technically, yes, there is, because pseudo-class is going to apply to the entire class. When you hover over something, you're hovering over, the entire element. When you hover over something, you're hovering over that entire element. When you select something, though, or when you talk about first letter, or you talk about first line, that's a portion of an element. So hover, you're hovering over the entire element. First letter, that's a portion of an element. So hover, because of the fact that it's already going to apply to an entire element, that's a class. The first letter, because of the fact that that's only a portion of an element, we need to create a brand new one. We need to do it on the fly. It's a pseudo element. That's why it's a pseudo element. That's honestly a very academic thing. I wouldn't really worry about trying to commit all of that to memory, and just let Visual Studio sort of guide you. I'll be honest, that's all that I ever do. The only time that I ever worry about pseudo-class versus pseudo-element is when I'm teaching CSS. When I'm using CSS, I'm not even thinking about it, then I'm just going in, a colon, and then just finding the item that I want. And if Visual Studio throws in a second colon, fantastic. And if it doesn't, fantastic. And I'm being real here. That's the way that I do it. I'm sure that's the way that you do it. And anybody else who's experienced with CSS, I'm certain that's the way that they do it as well. So if you want to get very, very technical, very, very propeller head, that's the difference between the two. Personally, I wouldn't worry too much about it.
Yeah. Some of you are also asking, why do the pseudo classes go before the pseudo elements? And I mean, that's just, it's order of, I guess, size is the best way I would put it. I mean, one, like Christopher just said, applies to the entire element.
Right.
I mean, the pseudo classes apply to the entire element. Whatever properties put on it is for the entire element. Whereas the pseudo element is a smaller part of that. So it goes from less specific to more specific, and that's the way you would order it in your CSS selector.
Exactly, yeah, because I'm trying to drill down into it. So I'm starting at the div tag, so I'm looking for, hey, I want a div tag. Okay, now inside this div tag, I'm looking for just the first one.
Yeah.
And so then inside of just that first one, now I want that first letter. So I'm really just kind of drilling right down on into it. So yeah, that's a perfect way to describe it.
Yeah, because it wouldn't make sense if you said, well, what is the first child of a selected line? I mean, that's not something that really makes sense. Because logic-wise, I don't know how to put that.
No, that's perfect. That's perfect. Yeah. Okay. Cool. So, pseudo classes, pseudo elements, and again, it gives you that ability to go in and find exactly what it is that you're looking for. Now, again, those of you that have done CSS, you're probably looking at my demos thus far, and you're probably complaining about two very big things. The first thing that you're probably complaining about is the fact that I'm putting all my CSS into that file. Again, I'm doing that just to make my demos easier. The second thing you're probably complaining about is you'll notice that I've hard-coded in all of those font sizes. So I said that I want it to be 20 pixels and 36 pixels and so forth. That's really not a good practice, because the problem with that is that as things resize, I would then have to go into each item and resize it. So if I wanted a different font size for mobile, and I wanted a different font size for tablets, and I wanted a different font size for printing, I would then have to go in and resize everything. And I've got way too many better things to do with my time than try to, resize everything. So let's have a discussion then about sizing and about some sizing best practices here. Now, you are going to notice that CSS does give you the ability to do absolute sizes. And I'm going to say right away, just stay away from centimeters, millimeters, and inches, because it's never going to come out the way that you want it to. Just stay away from those, and really focus in on picas, points, pixels, and for me personally, I don't know if you use something different. I always find myself reaching for pixels, just because I find that I get the most consistency across all devices, and I find that it comes out the best. I don't know if you're different. Okay.
I do the same. Also, I mean, when you're sizing things besides text, you usually would use pixels or use something relative. So pixels, just across the board, it's good.
Yeah, exactly. Now, the thing about pixels is that it's an absolute size. So if I say I want something to be this many pixels, guess how big it's going to be? That many pixels. Period. End of sentence. Well, wouldn't it be nice if we could just set a size somewhere as our base, and then size everything else based off of that base? And that's where our relative sizes come into play. Now, the two main relative sizes that I want to highlight here are EM and REM. Now, EM is based on the font size of the current element. So if I go in and I set up, let's say div, and I set that to be 16 pixels, and I want to do something based on that for the first letter, then I would want to use EM because it's based on the current element. REM, however, is an 80s, 90s alternative band. No, REM is based on the size of the HTML element, which, by the way, is 16 pixels by default. So let's actually go back in and kind of size things a little bit better here. So you'll notice 16 pixels up top. So rather than me going in and saying our font size of 20 pixels, let's size it based off of that main font. So I just want it a bit bigger than that main font. So let's say that I want that to be about 25% bigger. So 1.25 of REM. So you can think about it as a percent. That's always the way that I think about it. So 125% or 1.25 of that REM. So it's going to be a little bit bigger. And in the case of our first, we want that much, much bigger. So let's go in and maybe set that to be 2.25 REM. And in this particular case, we want that, a scotch bigger. And let's go in and say 1.50 REM. And do I have any other sizes in here? I think I'm good. I'm good. Okay, cool. So now let's come back over to my browser and let's go ahead and hit refresh. And you're going to notice there's not a lot of change on my screen, because I basically kept everything reasonably close. And unless you're, busting out a ruler and measuring everything, you're probably not noticing any real difference until I do this. So all it takes now is for me to make one change. And I'm going to make a drastic change here. I'm going to change this to 10, which I know is very, very small. But the takeaway that I want you to get is that the moment I do that, everything else goes in line with it. And I really should also have updated this as well. Let's go 1.25 REM. There we go. And so now, if I resize that, you'll notice everything else goes in line with it. And this becomes very powerful when we're talking about our page layouts and our media queries, because I'm going to want to be able to resize our fonts for tablets and for desktops. And I don't want to have to go in, especially if I've got something like this, where, I've got, like 4 or 5 different options now for div tags and all sorts of different font sizes. I don't want to have to go in and resize each one of those for each individual screen size. So I don't have to. So all I have to do is one single update and everything else falls in line. Make your life easier. Go with relative sizes. Set that size once and go relative from there on out. If you need something to be an explicit size, then obviously, yes, use explicit sizing. But especially when you're talking about things like fonts and trying to work in a mobile-first world, go with relative sizes. It's going to make your life that much easier.
Yeah. So what would have happened if you changed it from REM to EM?
That's a fantastic question. So if I would have changed it from REM to EM, so let's do this. I'm going to go with kind of the big one here, which is our first letter. Actually, no. What do I want? I want this. I'm going to change this to EM, and I'm going to go really big here. So I'm going to go 3 EM, and I'm going to go in, and I'm going to hit refresh here. And you'll notice that I'm getting a much bigger space there because of the fact that it's still coming off of my HTML. So it's coming off of the parent because that's now flowing down to everything else. So EM versus REM here isn't going to make a huge difference. But let's talk about this first letter and this first line, because that's really where EM shines. Because remember, what's my goal? My goal with using that first line and that first letter was really to try and highlight that versus the rest of the paragraph. So I want that to be bigger based on the rest of the paragraph. So that's where EM is going to shine. So I don't want to do it based off the rest of the document. I want to do it based off of this. So I want it to be much bigger than the rest of that. So maybe I want that first letter to be 3 times as big as that div section. And I want that first line to be, let's say, 2 times as big as that div section. So I go in and I say 3 EM and I say 2 AM, and I come back and I hit refresh, and you'll notice it's nice and big. Now let's again kind of keep going with that compare and contrast here. Where's my div tags? Trying to think of a really good... okay, let's go off of first child here. And I'm going to explicitly size my first child here. I think this is going to kind of bring it all together here. And I'm going to make this really big. I'm going to say 30 pixels. Okay, now this is going to be, I think, a good example of REM versus EM. EM is going to be based off of this, because I've now said that that first child, I want that to be 30 pixels. EM is going to be based off of that, so this should be 90 pixels big, as opposed to whatever was inside of HTML, which, if I remember right, was currently set to 10, so it should be 30. So if it was REM, that would be 30. EM is going to be 90 pixels. I think I'm doing my math right. Hit save, hit refresh. Yes, that's 90 pixels. So you'll notice that that's huge, and you'll also notice, kind of as a perfect example, that that up there wasn't impacted. That's still going to be, in this case, our 10 pixels. So there's the difference in inaction of EM versus REM. So EM is based off of that current element. REM is based off of whatever was set on HTML. Does that bring that together?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Cool. All right. Now, up until now, I've got to fix that. Hold on one second. Control Z. That's just going to drive me crazy. Control Z and Control Z, and let's go back and change that to 16. Okay. Now then. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this back up in Internet Explorer, and I'm going to fire up Chrome here. Now, what you're going to notice is, on the whole, these are similar, but you are, going to notice that they're certainly not the same, that the font size is definitely different in Chrome versus IE. And this is going to be one of the biggest challenges that you're going to have working with CSS is that, like you mentioned earlier, and I think you put it perfectly, which was essentially that CSS is a standard by the W3C, and they essentially suggest that browsers do this, this, and this. But it's not a requirement by any stretch of the imagination. So a lot of different things will work in one browser, but won't necessarily work in another browser. And sometimes the difference is going to be pretty drastic. Sometimes it's not going to be as bad. So you will always have to go in and play around from browser to browser to browser to make sure that things work well in all browsers, or at least are kind of close enough in all browsers. And so you'll notice on the sizing here that the sizing is going to be handled. Oh, wait a minute. No, I'm sorry. There we go. See, it was funny because I'm looking at this and I'm going, I know that all of that's supposed to work in Chrome, and it's not, and I'm just going to kind of roll with it. There we go. Okay, so all of that works better. There we go. Now, here's one spot where things can differ, and Chrome may have updated this real recently. So if all of a sudden this works the way that it's supposed to work in Chrome, then they updated it. One very cool thing that you can do is you can also size things based on the screen size. And that's by using VW or VH. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that it's not supported in all browsers. And you'll notice that it winds up being that unit of measurement is 1% of the viewport, so the portion of the screen that you're currently looking at, the width and the height. So if I go back in to Visual Studio here, and let me grab my article, and let's say that I want my article's width, and I only want that to take up, let's say, 75% of the screen, I could say 75 VW, viewport width. And so if I go in and I hit save, and I come back over here to Chrome, and I come back over here to Internet Explorer, okay, cool. Chrome did update this. This actually is relatively new. What you're going to notice is that there is now that little bit of white space, and it's all based on the size of the browser. Now, the point that I was really trying to make here, kind of bringing it all the way back to where I started by opening up Chrome, is you do have to be careful with CSS because things change over time. So it was like 2 months ago that I last went in and kind of worked around with that, and that wasn't there, that wasn't supported. It is now supported. You always have to test in all browsers. Always have to test in all browsers. Okay. All right. Anything else to there?
I think that was a really good explanation of the different sizes. I think especially the discussion of REM versus EM, that sizing thing.
Yeah.
Great explanation.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, with that, let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. And then we're going to come on back and we're going to take a look at page layout. So we took a look at how to go in and select all of our items. Now it's time to actually examine how we can put things where we want them and stop using tables. All right, we'll see you guys in 10 minutes.